Final Fantasy franchise has pushed storytelling in a way that no other franchise was able to achieve at the time. Everything from the music, to the character design, and to the story itself were all crafted in a way that raised the bar for how games are presented. The original Final Fantasy was designed by Hironobu Sakaguchi, who was given the difficult task to produce a game that could either save Squaresoft from going out of business, or the game that would become Squaresoft's swan song. In 1987, the first Final Fantasy was developed and published, and for the next 35 years, Final Fantasy would consistently find ways to make the franchise innovate and iconic among the Japanese role-playing game genre. The earlier Final Fantasy titles relied on turn-based battles, but there was one other genre that Sakaguchi was fond of, the tactical role-playing game genre. Sakaguchi had wanted to make a tactical RPG of his own, and even came up with the concept of Final Fantasy Tactics in 1993, but he had to commit to the mainline Final Fantasy games as they were coming out every 12 to 18 months at the time. But in 1995, Final Fantasy Tactics would finally begin development, not from Sakaguchi, but from Square's newest hire, Yasumi Matsuno. Matsuno had been a mainstay of Quest Corporation from 1989 to 1995, releasing 3 games for them: Conquest of the Crystal Palace, Ogre Battle March of the Black Queen, and Tactics Ogre Let Us Cling Together. His game followed more realistic themes than other JRPGs at the time, featuring themes like civil war and genocide. Tactics Ogre was also one of the earliest JRPGs to feature the Church is Evil trope. Frustrated with the way Quest Corporation had been organized, Matsuno and select members that worked on the Ogre games left and joined Squaresoft. Final Fantasy Tactics grew from an idea Sakaguchi had in 1993 to a work in progress that began in 1995. Matsuno was aiming to create a tactical role-playing game that emphasized the personal growth of the main characters on their journey, as opposed to Tactics Ogre, which was primarily centered around the growth of the protagonist and his army. The similarities between the two games were the battles, having each character's turn come up based on their speed stats, versus waiting for one player to move all their characters and waiting for the enemy AI to move their characters, like in Japan's other popular tactical RPG series, Fire Emblem. The battle system for Tactics was designed by Hiroyuki Ito, who created the active time battle system introduced in Final Fantasy IV. The artwork for the game was done by Hiroshi Minagawa and Akihiko Yoshida. They used more hand-drawn artwork for the game and the promotion of the game, as opposed to Final Fantasy VII, mostly relying on CGI art and 3D graphics. The score for the game was composed by Hitoshi Sakamoto and Masaharu Iwata, who had scored Ogre Battle and Tactics Ogre before being recruited for Final Fantasy Tactics. Also on the Square side was Taku Murata, who served as the game's lead programmer. Murata's previous experience was being the boss programmer for Secret of Mana and the general programmer for Trials of Mana. Comparing his experience in Quest Corporation, Matsuno felt that working at Squaresoft was more democratic and accepting of team ideas. Final Fantasy Tactics would be the first game set in the fictional fantasy world of Ivalice. When this game first came out, the world of Ivalice was nothing more than the game's setting, but Ivalice would end up becoming one of the most well-known worlds among the library of Squaresoft, later Square Enix. Ivalice would become a recurring setting for Matsuno-involved titles.
イバリスは僕はスクエアに入って最初に作った作品なんですけども、そういう意味では自分のその描きたいものを自由に描けるキャンパスのようなものだと思っています。それは多分今はその僕以外の人たちもいろんな夢とかそういった想像したものを広げていくわけなので、誰もがその新しく作れるものを描けるようなキャンパスなんじゃないかなと思っています。
Final Fantasy XII would feature battles against summon beasts known as Espers. Some of these Espers were based on the Lusavi demons from Tactics. Cuchulian, Belius, Zalera, Adramelech, Hashmal, and Ultima. In addition to those espers, a secret summon beast from Tactics also appears as an esper in 12, Zodiarch. Zodiarch also happens to be the name of the recurring antagonist in Final Fantasy XIV's story, who is being summoned by major antagonist Elidibus, who happens to share the name of the secret boss character in Tactics. Final Fantasy Tactics would originally be released in Japan in June 1997, 4 months after the original release of Final Fantasy VII. In North America, the game would be released in January 1998, 3 months after the North American release of Final Fantasy VII. Despite how close it was to the release of the more popular Final Fantasy VII, Tactics would still become one of the most well-received Final Fantasy games, as well as one of the most well-received strategy games. In 2007, the game would be re-released for the PlayStation Portable as Final Fantasy Tactics: The War of the Lions. This re-release would feature a new localized script, new story scenarios, animated cutscenes, and multiplayer modes. The PSP version would be the first official release of the game for Europe and Australasia territories. The North American release of this port has the cutscenes fully voice-acted, featuring talents like Phil Lamar.
What then is your end in all of this, Delita? I fear I do not know.
Robin Atkin Downes.
Do you remember, Ramza? When your father showed us how to make a whistle of a blade of grass.
Kari Walgren.
Do not mock me! Please. I could not bear it.
Haiti Burris.
I owe you my thanks as well. But he's right. The northern sky will not be long in falling on us now.
Gideon Emery.
I'm no thief. I'm a sky pirate.
And Justin Charles Cowden.
Let's see how you swallow this!
Guided by the goal to create an accessible tactical role-playing game set in the Final Fantasy universe, Yasumi Matsuno worked to improve on the ideas he had implemented in the games he worked on with Quest Corporation. It was a combination of what worked well with Tactics Ogre with what made the Final Fantasy series memorable. A memorable cast ensemble, a complex plot, memorable music, an engrossing battle system, and a fully developed world. Final Fantasy Tactics may have been a spin-off, but Tactics still ended up becoming a favorite among fans of both the mainline Final Fantasy games and tactical role-playing games as a whole.
I couldn't believe my luck when I met Claudia. She's been great to me, always taken pride in her appearance. She does a fantastic job of the housework, and she's a cordon bleu cook. Problem is, she's always hated football. That's why I left her and moved in with Sue.
Final Fantasy Tactics, composed by Hitoshi Sakamoto and Masaharu Iwata, a spin-off of the Final Fantasy franchise from director Yasumi Matsuno, who up until Final Fantasy Tactics was known for the Ogre series, with arguably his greatest contribution being Tactics Ogre. He joined Square and worked on the game that would combine what he made for Tactics Ogre with the Final Fantasy series. His intention was to make a tactics game that was more streamlined and accessible when compared to the multi-story driven, more complex Tactics Ogre. Joining him are the two composers who helped enhance his games, Hitoshi Sakamoto and Masaharu Iwata. Unlike Nobu Uematsu's score for Final Fantasy VII, Final Fantasy Tactics uses more realistic sounding instrument samples. A large portion of the soundtrack is more dramatic, grand, and intense than any of the scores for the main entry Final Fantasy titles. According to Matsuno in an interview with Famicom Tsushin, translated by Shmuplations, this was done because Sakamoto and Iwata's music were usually more energetic, upbeat, and exciting. With a game like Final Fantasy Tactics, where you were fighting other humans for nearly the entire game in a war-driven world, the music had to be more dramatic. Sakamoto composed 47 of the pieces for the game, while Iwata composed the other 24. Neither composer worked on an individual piece together. Each piece they composed was done individually. Since 1988, they have worked together on roughly a dozen games, 2 of them including games in the Ogre franchise. The two would continue to work on the same games, leading up to the founding of one of the largest Japanese indie game music companies, Bassescape. With its dramatic presentation, memorable cast ensemble, and higher quality music than what was usually heard in a Final Fantasy game up at that point, Final Fantasy Tactics became the definitive spin-off for the Final Fantasy franchise. It introduced many gamers to the music talents of Sakamoto and Iwata. But little do they know that this wouldn't be the last time they would play a game featuring the two talents and their ability to create dramatic music.
An evil empire is sucking the life force from the planet, destroying all that's in its path. It's up to one soldier of fortune to save the world. If he succeeds, you survive. If he fails, you can always hit the reset button. Final Fantasy VII.
PlayStation.
Over, Jarek. Shinnok is dead. The good guys won. You're coming back with me.
Never, Sonya. I agreed to help defeat Shinnok, not turn myself into the Special Forces. The Black Dragon, live on!
The Black Dragon died with Kano. You're the last one, Jarek.
Never!
Come in, Major Briggs. This is Lieutenant Sonya Blade. Over.
Sonya, glad to hear you're alive.
You actually sound happy to hear from me, Jax. Things get boring?
Not since you followed Liu Kang into the Netherrealm.
Well, it's over now. I'm returning to base. 10-4, Jax. Jarek, Shinnok is dead. The good guys won. You're coming back with me.
Never, Sonya. I agreed to help defeat Shinnok, not turn myself into the Special Forces. The Black Dragon, live on!
The Black Dragon died with Kano. You're the last one, Jarek.
Never!
Come in, Major Briggs. This is Lieutenant Sonya Blade. Over.
This is Jax. Are you there?
Black Dragon died with Kano. You're the last one, Jarek.
Never!
Come in, Major Briggs. This is Lieutenant Sonya Blade. Over.
going somewhere, Jarek? Jax! I thought you were going to... Thought I was what, dead? Like my partner you just tossed off the cliff? I'm sorry, Jax. Please, don't drop me. Wait, I promise. Too late, Jarek. You can't drop me. You have to uphold the law. You have to arrest me. Wait, this is brutality. You can't do it. Wrong, Jarek. This is not a brutality. This is a fatality.
野球しようぜ。
オッケー。
行こう行こう。お前ら今日はやったよ。
任しとけ。
姿三四郎。ほら。
姿三四郎。
姿三四郎。